नमस्कार दोस्तों, द ईकॉन सीरीज में मैं चिरायु भट्ट आपका हार्दिक स्वागत करता हूं। जैसा कि आपको पता है, इकॉन सीरीज के पहले एपिसोड में हमने बात की थी प्रोफेसर गामिनी जयसूर्या से, सेकंड एपिसोड में हमने बात की थी डॉक्टर गाजी हसन से, और आज हम बहुत ही खुशकिस्मत है कि हमारे साथ प्रोफेसर अनानिश चौधरी बैठे हैं। अनानिश चौधरी किसी तारीफ या तारुफ के मोहताज नहीं है। आप सिर्फ उनका नाम गूगल में लिखिए एंड यू फाइंड आउट द वर्क दैट ही हैज़ डन। उन्होंने टीवी एनजेड के लिए इंटरव्यूज़ दिए हैं, stuff.co.nz के लिए इंटरव्यूज़ किए हैं, न्यूमरस आर्टिकल्स लिखे हैं, बुक्स लिखी हैं। उनकी बात को गौर से सुना जाता है। आज वो जो कुछ कहेंगे, सरकार हो या आम आवाम हो या पब्लिक हो, सब गौर से सुनेंगे। तो इट विल बी वेरी इंटरेस्टिंग। आइए जानने की कोशिश करते हैं उनके थॉट्स। हेलो सर।
Thank you for having me. Thanks, Chirag.
माय प्लेजर।
Thank you.
Sir, my first question is, looking at Labour government's overall handling of the COVID-19 situation, what are the things that government did correctly? What are the things that should have been done in a better way? And what are the things that should have been avoided?
So that's a fairly broad question, and it's difficult to kind of distinguish some of these from one another, right? So let's start at the beginning. So COVID-19 was supposedly a new coronavirus. Now, initially, of course, we did not know exactly how to deal with it. So the first lockdown that we had, you could kind of justify that by saying that the government needed some time to make sure that we had the right
Yes.
support systems in place, hospitals, ICUs, and things like that. But reasonably quickly, we began to understand that COVID-19 wasn't as deadly as we had presumed in the beginning. So initially, people said that the mortality rate was as much as 3%, which is quite high. But then we quickly figured out by the middle of the year that the mortality rate was just about 0.6%, which means it's about 6 to 7 people per 1,000. That's not very high. So just to put this in perspective, people have talked a lot about the Spanish flu. The Spanish flu was far more deadly than
That came in 1920.
That came in 1918, 1990, yes. So some of the initial reaction by the government can be understood, but some of the subsequent ones not so much, because, see, we face different crises all the time. Whether it's a global financial crisis or COVID-19, there'll be another crisis down the road. So when you face these crises, a key response must depend on a response that's proportional to the risk. And more importantly, what you need to look at is, regardless of what you do, there will be costs and benefits, right? So in economics, you know this, we call
Yes.
this opportunity cost
Yes,
or
yeah.
trade-offs, right? So what you want to make sure is that preferably the costs exceed the benefits, right? So where the government has gone wrong was an excessively risk-averse response to this disease. So something that's not in response. So, as I mentioned a little while ago, if you look at, for instance, Gladys Berejiklian in New South Wales, she has managed this without any lockdowns.
Wow.
And their response has been much more proportional. So, for instance, as you know, there was one case of COVID-19 in New South Wales, and we decided to suspend the travel bubble. That doesn't make a lot of sense. These are
Yes.
gross overreactions. And as a result of those overreactions, we now are facing a scenario where GDP declined about 5% at the end of 2020, right? Now, of course, you can say, well, given what happened, the government was quite right in putting into place the wage subsidies, for instance. The government was justified in engaging in deficit financing, increasing debt to kind of create jobs, etc. But
Keynesian model, yeah.
yes, the Keynesian, exactly,
Yes.
the Keynesian model. But the problem is that those things are predicated on assuming or conceding that the government's decision was right, and it probably wasn't. I mean, there are very few countries in the world that has devoted so much time and energy to eliminating COVID-19. It's not clear we had to eliminate COVID-19. We live with many other viruses in our day-to-day lives.
Yes.
So COVID-19 isn't as deadly that we had to eliminate it, and we have devoted an enormous amount of time and energy. Even now, we are spending millions of dollars on this managed isolation system. Why? Because the risk is low to start with. And once a risk has become fairly low, and similar to many other kind of day-to-day risks,
It doesn't make any sense, yeah.
Exactly, that we experience, pushing it further and further down, or trying to push it further down, increases the costs exponentially, right? So a lot of these things were mistakes. So I'm saying that a lot of this. So the basic point is that there was excessive risk aversion, and as a result, the economy will pay a price. The cost of keeping the economy closed for such a long time is catastrophic. These are spending changes. This is Auckland. That's the first lockdown.
Yes.
Look at the drop.
Minus 60.
This is our second August lockdown, and that's our early this year lockdown. Okay. Now look at what's happening to industries, right? Food and liquor, not too bad. This is tourism. Look at what's happening to tourism or store-based retail.
Yeah.
I think what a lot of people don't seem to understand is this is how much we make from dairy products. This is how much we make from meat products. This is how much we make from lumber, fruit. This is how much we make from tourism, right?
Yes.
Okay. So you've destroyed that industry, or you're in the
16 billion
process of destroying this industry. So the government said, "Oh, travel within New Zealand, enjoy your backyard, fine." But that can only happen maybe one time, the
Yes.
Kiwis travel. But year on year, you cannot expect to keep this up based on Kiwi tourism. And it is not the case that this will come right back when you reopen the economy, because the flights have disappeared. Airline companies have started rerouting their flights. So this is what the elimination strategy is doing. This is, look at what happened to border crossings. This is our elimination strategy. Look at what has happened now. So there is no way that anybody could argue that we can do this and not hurt the economy. That just doesn't make any sense. Okay.
Very good point.
Here's the other issue. In the newspapers, you will find that people have talked about, oh, unemployment rate is very low, 4.7%, 4.9%. Okay, fine. But now if you look at Stats New Zealand and you look at the number of job seeker benefit recipients, there are people who are receiving benefits but unemployed, that has gone up massively over the last year.
Yes.
How can that be? If unemployment is dropping, how can the job seeker benefits go up? Similarly,
देखिए किसी भी थिंक टैंक से बात करने का यही फायदा होता है. कितना खूबसूरत पॉइंट ये रेस कर रहे हैं. प्रोफेसर चौधरी हमें समझाने की कोशिश कर रहे हैं कि अगर अनएम्प्लॉयमेंट लो है तो बेनिफिट सीकर की तादाद कैसे बढ़ रही है. इट डजंट मेक एनी सेंस. जी सर, सॉरी.
No, that's okay. So similarly, if you look at Stats New Zealand has a measure called underutilization rate. What's the underutilization rate? This is people who are working part-time but would like to work full-time, or people who are not looking for jobs. So these are people who are, or think of these as laborers or labor hours that are sitting idle. That has gone up drastically. How can that be? So one answer must be, I don't know the answer, but one answer must be that there are people in the economy who have just effectively given up, right?
Wow.
So when you look at the unemployment rate, that is not giving you an accurate picture, because there are people there who are looking for jobs, like to work, but who are not looking or not getting anything. So on a number of these metrics, the picture isn't particularly rosy, I think. But I'm going to stop here, and then I'll let you continue with...
Right. दूसरा जो क्वेश्चन है सर वो भी एक्सटेंशन ही है. What advice would you give to the government to repay the COVID-19 debt?
So there are two aspects to this, right? So the first aspect is that the COVID-19 debt does not have to be repaid. So even if you assume that the government has built up a large amount of debt, and that is true. So from 2020 till about 2023-24, our government debt, this is just crown public debt, will go to almost 56%, 60% of GDP.
GDP.
Though recent, just now the government is saying it won't get there. It might be less. Okay. Now, at one level, this is not actually a very high level of debt. Japan, for instance, has 200% GDP as debt. Greece, Portugal, many of these countries have very high levels of debt. So at some level, you don't need to repay that debt. The problem, of course, is if you don't repay that debt, if the government is borrowing, then what typically happens is the government is also trying to raise capital like businesses. Mm-hmm. That does two things. That tends to make it more difficult for businesses to borrow, which is typically called crowding out in economics. And the other is that it starts to push interest rates up. Mm-hmm. So what's going to happen is interest rates will start to tick up over time. Mm-hmm. We can come back to this, but to counteract that, the government has been doing a lot of what's called quantitative easing, which is essentially printing money to keep interest rates low. But let's leave that aside for a minute. So at one level, the government doesn't have to repay the debt. And as long as people are willing to hold the debt, the government can carry that for the foreseeable future. Okay. Yeah. The other option, of course, is what most people would say is, well, then we must figure out a way of taxing people more and things like that to increase the debt, which has pros and cons. The government has increased the top marginal tax rate to 39%. That's peanuts. That's a very small amount of money. So the answer would be to increase economic activity.
Yes.
Right? To grow the pie so that there's more for everyone. There's only one answer. We need to open up the economy.
Yeah.
We need to bring people in. New Zealand is a very small country in the middle of the South Pacific. We don't make most of our things. We cannot continue like this. We need tourists. That's our biggest export industry.
$16 billion industry.
Yes.
Yes.
So there's no way we can continue to survive without tourists. And education is our fifth biggest export industry, right? International students.
$5 billion industry.
Exactly. So you need those students to come back, and not doing that, I mean, has hobbled the tourists, it's hobbled the universities. So as I keep saying, the COVID risk now is fairly low, and the government should be able to manage it. And I've written extensively on how you manage some of these things. Instead of spending so much money on managed isolation, you can ask people to self-isolate.
Yes.
And then you can violate, you can say, this is what we want you to do. You can prosecute some of the violators. But see, the problem is that we have this huge system, and then once in a while, one or two people will escape from managed isolation, and that becomes big news. No one seems to understand that thousands of people are coming in, they're obeying the rules, they're playing by the rules, and that's completely ignored. So what I'm saying is that in many of these things, the costs that we're incurring far exceed any potential benefits.
Yes.
Just to give an example, I'm not a big supporter of either party, but you probably know this, that the National Party said that they argued for building this isolation facility in Paramoremo, right? Why? Why don't you take the money and just build a hospital? Or just create some more ICU units? Why would you build an MIQ facility, like a prison? Right? I mean, the money that we have spent, we could have used that money to bolster our health services.
Yes. So
that we can respond immediately if COVID cases appear.
We could have used the money for the betterment of the infrastructure as well.
Infrastructure, ICUs, ventilators, but we didn't. We are spending billions of dollars or millions of dollars. And we keep hearing these beds are empty. And now, of course, the rooms are empty in MIQ. And now, of course, if you travel anywhere, it's not just the flight, but you have to find an empty space in MIQ and things along those lines. And the other issue, of course, is there is a racial aspect to all of this, right? I mean, all of this COVID thing happened. We never stopped flights from United States or United Kingdom or Europe, but when it came to India, we had to stop the flights immediately. And it's okay for cricket players to come back from India, but it's not okay for non-Indian like Indians to come back from India.
Yes. See, Professor Chaudhary ये कहना चाह रहे हैं कि all these things are hurting brand New Zealand image as well, you know. अगर कल border खुल भी जाती है, कितने लोग यहाँ आना चाहेंगे अगर इस तरह का मैनेजमेंट हमारा रहा तो, ये भी वो कहना चाह रहे हैं. जी सर, sorry.
Yes, exactly. I'm saying that this is sending a wrong message to many. And if you wanted to market, so I was in India in 2019. I visited a whole bunch of universities telling students to come to study in New Zealand. But this is a worry. I mean, I would be worried, right? I mean, if the country is going to respond in this way to a crisis by shutting down the borders, by making it clear that, okay, Indian citizens not welcome, or New Zealand citizens of Indian ethnicity not welcome, or New Zealand citizens of non-white ethnicity you're not welcome. I'm not going to do any more selling because I cannot say with a straight face that yes, we are welcome. You are not really.
Yes.
I mean, that's what's become clear, and that's unfortunate. And just to give an example, I mean, this is in the newspapers. New Zealand, to a large extent, and Australia, we are now losing these international students to UK, to Canada, to Ireland. They're all because they're tired of waiting. Just to give an example, I have a PhD student who was admitted last year. He still hasn't managed to come. So I don't know how long. I mean, this is just one case, but how long can he wait?
Yeah.
And
So we are losing on talent as well, Very good point,
We
sir.
are losing enormously on talent.
Yes.
With the students are talents, we're also losing on talent for
We are losing
workers.
We are losing revenue, talent, everything.
Whether it's software, IT people, doctors, nurses, we rely on some of these people coming from overseas. We don't have enough of our own, and we are not getting them now. And the assumption is that, one day we'll open the border, they'll come rushing back in. I don't think so, but I'll be happy if I'm proved wrong.
No worries. Thank you, sir. Third question. How about an amnesty and pathway to residency for temporary visa holders, having charged them a certain amount? See, there are 300,000 temporary migrants living in New Zealand. We could charge them, say, 10 grand or 15 grand, and maybe we can issue them a 10-year work permit or 10-year visa, and they can contribute. They have been contributing to the economy, but in that sense, we will generate some additional revenue as well, and they will get a secured future as well. What's your thought on that? I know you said that we don't have to pay the debt immediately.
No, but I don't know if that raises all that much money. I mean, you could, but it doesn't raise all that much money. I'll have to look at the numbers. I don't know. But
Yes.
But look, here's the point. The point is you don't have to do those things.
Mm-hmm.
You don't have to charge citizens or residents or people with work permit because the evidence is clear. The people who come to New Zealand and most other countries in the world, these are relatively young people who come to work.
Yes.
And therefore, their net fiscal, what's called their net fiscal impact, which is how much revenue, extra revenue do they generate versus how much demands do they make on things like hospital services or schools.
Yes.
The net impact is a large positive number for these people. So immigrants coming in, whether for China or India or the Pacific Islands, these people generate more revenue than they cost the system.
Right.
So you don't really have to charge them extra necessarily. If you allow them to come in, they will grow the economic pie.
Yes.
Compared to how much they'll demand. Because these are people, these are not old people who are going to look for superannuation benefits. These are people who will work, they'll pay taxes, and they'll be productive members of society. And those taxes will pay for some of these things.
Yes. They are going to be an asset for the economy, not a liability. Yeah.
I mean, this is, I wrote this article a couple of years ago saying, let's explode some myths about immigration.
Yes.
And I cited this study, I think it's by Burl or someone, which shows what the impact is. Now, of course, you could take the position that, New Zealand is a white country, so why do we need so many Indians and Chinese? But that's not an economic question. You could say that, but But I'm saying purely from an economic perspective, benefits immigration are massive. And even I said this, I was teaching a lecture. The only country in the world where this benefit is possibly not a large positive number is maybe United States. Partly because the United States actually has a far more liberal immigration policy than other countries. See, what is the immigration policy in UK, Canada, New Zealand, Australia? It's all skills based.
Yes.
You either have to show advanced degrees or money and things like that. The USA basically lets people in on a wide variety of things, and they are much more liberal about family migration. So because of that, in the United States, the mix of migrants has changed a little bit from younger towards older.
What a beautiful point. Yes,
Right?
very good point.
And as it's changed from towards the older, then you have greater demands on healthcare systems and hospitals. That's absolutely not true for countries like New Zealand. Most people coming here are young, they're not. So the net benefit is huge.
Great. Thank you, sir. This is the highlighted question of the interview. If you were the Finance Minister Grant Robertson, what are the 3 things that you would do to kickstart the economy?
I don't know if there are 3 things I would do to kickstart the economy. I mean, there are many things. I necessarily am not an expert. The first thing, of course, would be to restore business as usual.
Yes.
Right? I mean, our elimination strategy and keeping the borders closed is hurting the economy.
Yes.
It's hurting businesses. It's even hurting a lot of the agricultural sector. So in April 1, we increased the minimum wage. And I wrote an article saying that I'm mostly in favor of raising the minimum wage, except it's actually not a good idea to raise the minimum wage when the labor market is very soft, because you tend to lose.
The timing is wrong.
Timing is wrong. And what I also did not understand at the time is that because we have raised the minimum wage and we have also completely shut off the arrival of seasonal workers, a lot of orchards and agribusinesses have found it very tough going. So we need to look into those kinds of things. So as I said, the first thing would be to open the borders, bring people in, manage COVID. And here's the crazy thing. See, the government understands this. I wrote an article where even Jacinda Ardern has said this. She is saying that, look, we have to manage COVID like we manage the seasonal flu. It's not as if, the vaccine will take care of all of it. So, people will have to be vaccinated. So they seem to understand it, but they have staked so much pride and reputation on this elimination strategy that, oh, we are this small country of the team of 5 million that managed to eliminate COVID, that they're now finding it very difficult to back down from that.
Yes.
Just as, all of a sudden you had a pay freeze. Why? Right? Because if your entire shtick is about this well-being budget and you don't want to engage in austerity to reduce the debt, why are you doing a pay freeze, especially after 1 year when all these public service people have gone above and beyond their remit? All of a sudden, pay freeze. Now they're beginning to back down of it. But I think that's a problem with Jacinda Ardern and Grant Robertson. It's an ability to own up to things that are mistakes and say that, okay, we didn't get it right. They are consistently unable. Now, it's a political drawback in any case. Most politicians don't manage to do it. But they seem completely unable to own up to these things. And some of these has to change. And the other thing is that the government does not listen to any advice from their own experts.
Right. And why is that?
No, partly because they have a bit of an ideological thing that this is what we want to do. For instance, some of the climate change goals, should we be working to help the climate? Yes. But again, there must be a trade-off between cost and benefits. We cannot get to a point where we are incurring huge costs. Just to give an example, I kept saying this. I said, look, one of the largest killers worldwide is respiratory diseases. Right? So what's the answer to that? So suppose in India you want to reduce pollution. What do? Stop people driving. Why don't you just force people not to drive? It's not a feasible solution, right? So what do? You figure out a way of maybe taxing people, carbon tax, emission trading permits. But it's kind of market-based solutions to some of these things that allow for human incentives. I don't think our current government quite has a good grasp on some of those things.
राइट, थैंक यू सर. मैं प्रोफेसर चौधरी को स्कैंडिनेवियन मॉडल के बारे में भी कुछ पूछना चाहता था, लेकिन उन्होंने ऑफ द कैमरा मुझे बताया कि ये बहुत ही वास्ट टॉपिक है, तो उसके बारे में फिर कभी उनसे मुलाकात करके उनके थॉट्स जानने की कोशिश करते हैं. आज थोड़ा मूव ऑन करते हैं, स्पेसिफिकली न्यूजीलैंड मार्केट के बारे में बात कर रहे हैं. तो न्यूजीलैंड इज सफरिंग फ्रॉम इनकम इनइक्वालिटी. व्हाट कैन बी डन टू सॉर्ट दिस प्रॉब्लम आउट?
When you say income inequality, there's actually two aspects to it. So inequality can be in income and in can be in wealth, right? I don't know the exact numbers, but my conjecture is that New Zealand's income inequality is probably not as high as the income inequality in countries like the United States or Brazil. New Zealand probably has a lot more wealth inequality where people may not necessarily have cash flow, but they have property. And I don't know what can be done, mostly because some things don't necessarily have to be fixed, right? So as I was telling you, many of us could lose a bit of weight, but what is the ideal? Or you can define ideal weight. It's not quite easy to define. You obviously understand that it's not possible to have perfect equality, right? And actually people don't even want perfect equality. So one of the things I'm working on currently is trying to understand how people respond to inequality. For instance, people are actually somewhat okay if inequality results from merit. You worked hard, you make more. People are not so okay if inequality came by via luck. So just an accident of your birth or things like that. So first of all, it's not clear exactly how much income inequality and what we should do about it, whether we should do something about it. We probably should. Mm-hmm. But if you look at, for instance, the ratio of, say, executive compensation to, say, average worker compensation, it's not that high compared to the United States, etc. Mm-hmm. The wealth inequality is a slightly different question, mm-hmm. right? And one thing that is certainly true, and this again goes back to this broad question, so a few things will happen. So coming out of COVID-19, we will see an increase in both income inequality and particularly wealth inequality. Why? Because white-collar people like me, we could easily work from home. So lockdowns didn't affect our jobs. But if you were more of a blue-collar worker, or you had a job where you had to go into work, those are the jobs that people have lost. Right? So this COVID-19 recession has disproportionately hurt blue-collar workers as opposed to white-collar workers. And that's because of this huge penchant for locking down all the time. By locking down, you've actually made this worse. Mm. The other thing that has happened, and this is not in just New Zealand, globally, is we talked about this earlier, right? So when you have budget deficits, what happens is interest rates kind of tend to go up because governments are competing with businesses to borrow money.
Yes.
And obviously some companies are in trouble, so they may have just day-to-day credit problems, liquidity crunch. So essentially what you do is you print money, right? You buy government bonds, you print money, and you flood the system with money. One of the things that's supposed to do is lower interest rates. But one problem when you try to do some of these things is that often when you're in a recession and businesses are not expanding or hiring more workers, that's not necessarily because they find it difficult to borrow or because they have a credit or liquidity crisis. It's because they're just very uncertain. Mm-hmm. Should I expand my business? What if there's another lockdown, right? It's a policy uncertainty that creates this. Mm-hmm. So no matter how low the interest rates is, that may not necessarily change, right? Mm-hmm. So you have flooded the system with money, you haven't managed to move business investment. What is this doing? By keeping interest rates low in wealth inequality. So people who own assets will own even more assets, and people who don't own assets will fall further down. So this quantitative easing has certainly not been good. If your aim is to reduce wealth inequality, then maybe you should stop the quantitative easing and don't let the interest rates rise. Mm-hmm. If your aim is to reduce income inequality, then don't create situations where the white-collar workers are better off at as opposed to blue collar workers. Here's the other thing. See, one thing people haven't understood properly is that in all the recessions that we faced before, global financial crisis, things happened and governments were trying to respond to it.
Yes.
That's not true of COVID-19. What's happened in COVID-19 is governments are creating a recession with one hand and fighting it with the other hand.
Wow.
Right? So when you decide to lock down or do all these things, you are exacerbating the recession.
Yes.
You are actually deciding whether to make things better or worse. And then you're saying, okay, now that we have made things worse, we're now going to throw money at the problem.
Yes.
That's a very different situation than ones we had faced before.
So, in other words, we are cutting the branch on which we are sitting.
Correct.
Yeah.
So, depending on how these countries responded, where how risk averse you were, how much lockdown you enacted, what costs you incurred, that also has an impact on how much debt you have to put on, how much quantitative easing you have to do. But as I keep saying, in economics we call these endogenous. So these things are happening simultaneously. The more lockdowns you make, the more debt you have to throw at this problem.
Yes.
The more debt you accumulate, the more jobs you lose, the more wage subsidy you have to enact. So at some point you have to step back.
It's a vicious circle, eh? Yeah.
It's a bit like that,
Yes.
right? So in some senses, the government will have to take a step back and say, well, what have we gotten right? So just to give you an example, there was a Productivity Commission report that came out earlier last year, which said that the extra 5 days of lockdown that we had in April, the cost of that outweighs the benefit by about 90 to 1. Now, at any point of time,
The same point you were making earlier.
this would be a big news. Because the Productivity Commission is not a partisan body, it's a crown entity, like the Reserve Bank, like Treasury, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Their job is to advise the government. The government completely ignored that. So in all these things we have done, we haven't paused to think, are the benefits really bigger than the costs? So I talked to a journalist at staff and I was telling her some of these things. I said, can you tell me that this MIQ is really, it makes sense? And she said, well, presumably someone has looked at this. But the answer is, no one has. So we are doing all these things, we are without asking, because what do you want? This is public money, right? And what you want is the biggest bang for your buck. You want to spend your money in a way that generates maximum benefit, and it's not clear we are doing that right now.
Right. Last question, sir. New Zealand's economy has faced a number of long-term challenges in recent decades, including low productivity and wages, skill shortages, shallow domestic capital markets, a lack of diversification, and underinvestment in infrastructure. What are your thoughts on it?
Oh my goodness, that's a very, very, very big, again.
Whatever comes to your mind, sir.
It's a very broad topic. The productivity question remains a puzzle. Why our productivity is low, which is why our wages tend to be low. My view is that the answer to this is to be much more integrated in the global economic system. Yes. If our capital markets are shallow, the only way we can get out of that is to borrow capital from other countries, right? Currently, you probably know this, we have a lot of businesses delisting from NZX and listing on ASX. I mean, these things are not necessarily
very crucial point. Yes.
Right. So you need to be more integrated, right? So on a slightly different theme, one of our biggest worries now is superannuation, right? So people retired at 65, 50 years ago you retired at 65, you died at 70, 75. Now people are routinely living till 85, 90, which means now we're looking at paying people superannuation for 30 to 35 years. What are we going to do about it? Raise retirement age, lower payments, tax people more, right? And what is the problem? The problem is that our birth rates are very low, right? We have a lot more older people, not enough young people. So we don't have enough young people to pay taxes. What's the answer to this? Immigration. The only way you can satisfy some of this is to have immigrants come in, but that's obviously not, it tends to be controversial. Now, as an immigrant, I think that's a great thing, right? Many people think it's a great thing, but that's not necessarily true, which is one of the surprising things. I wrote this thing, and even Gareth Morgan, who's sort of the Opportunity Party, said, oh no, this is incorrect. And I said, it's not incorrect, and you should know that it's not incorrect, right? Now, if you argue that, well, we only want certain types of immigrants, that's not going to happen. You're going to get lots of immigrants from Europe because they have many other options, or you would get lots of immigrants from other countries. But anyway, I don't know if you want to go there. But so these are long-term problems. And if the fundamental problem is that we are a small country in the middle of the South Pacific. So
we need to make our country more integrated.
Correct. So transport costs are higher and things like that. So we need to move into more value-added type of activities, not lumber and meat and dairy, right? We need to become things that can be done electronically, not via ships and trucks and things like that, right? So financial services and things along those lines, software. So I don't really have a very good feel for whether our governments are, I think John Key's government tried to do something like that, like bring in financial service in New Zealand. I'm not exactly sure why he didn't succeed. It's also not an easy market, right? I mean, if you're a financial trader globally, you would rather be in London than in Auckland.
Why would you come
right?
here? Yeah.
So it's not this is not easy, but you have to set a goal and kind of work towards it persistently.
Step by step.
And maybe that's what's missing then, that having a vision and working towards it.
Thank you so much.
Sure, no problem.
Chaudhary.
No, thank you for having me.
देवी और
Thanks a
सज्जनों,
lot.
क्या ज़बरदस्त ख्यालात उन्होंने अपने व्यक्त किए हैं। जैसा कि मैंने पहले मेंशन किया था, ही इज़ अ थिंक टैंक, और सरकार अगर उन्होंने जो बातें की हैं उसमें से 50% 60% अगर अप्लाई कर देगी तो मेरी और आपकी ज़िंदगी बहुत बेहतर हो जाएगी। मैं सबसे गुजारिश करूंगा कि ये इंटरव्यू देखने से पहले थोड़ा रिसर्च प्रोफेसर अनानिश चौधरी के बारे में करके ये इंटरव्यू देखिएगा, जिससे और मज़ा आएगा। थैंक यू सो मच फॉर योर टाइम।
Thank you very much. Thanks, Chirag.